Welcome, David, and thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Perfect. And, I was just telling our audience that you're part of the Saints Unscripted channel. And before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about what you do on Saints Unscripted?
Sure. Yeah, of course. So I joined as a host with the YouTube channel Saints Unscripted. Probably, I think it's been 5 years now since I joined up. And what I do, so soon after I joined up, there was kind of this realization that people had a lot of questions about doctrine, about history. The main show on Saints Unscripted is unscripted, right? So we're just kind of talking off the cuff. We're not reading from a teleprompter. But we realized that some of these issues that people are concerned about, that they're really hard to talk about just having a conversation, because we're not scholars. We're just regular Latter-day Saints. And so there was this idea to start a segment of the show, which is now called Faith and Beliefs, where it is so that is the scripted segment of the show, but I research and write those scripts. And that's really the main thing that I do with the channel right now, is researching and writing those videos and talking about some of the tough questions that people have, some of the historical issues that people want to talk about, and kind of shedding some light on those and trying to teach people how to research them, how to approach them from a faithful perspective, because there is a faithful perspective to these issues. But as we talked about before the videos, before we started recording, sometimes we don't see that. Sometimes we're presented with the more critical, antagonistic perspective, and we don't realize that Latter-day Saints that are faithful and believing have been dealing with a lot of these things for a long time, and there are good answers for a lot of these subjects, but sometimes we just don't know where to go to find them. So my job is to take those resources and digest them and present them in a way that regular Latter-day Saints are going to be able to understand and have the time to consume. So that's what I do, and it's a lot of fun.
Sounds a lot of fun. And, I think that before we talk about these things, because I think it'll be very interesting to see your perspective. You've done videos on pretty much every major criticism of the church, and you've also done many videos about just history of the church and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see your approach on history and things like that. And before we do that, I think that it'd be interesting to know a little bit more about you, right? Here in the channel, it's called Faith Journey. So we usually talk a little bit about people's faith journeys. And, what can you tell us about David growing up? Did you grow up in the church?
So yeah, I did grow up in the church. My parents are members. I grew up in Oregon. It's a state in the United States. If people aren't familiar with the states, I grew up in a small town in northeastern Oregon, a farming community, and I was a religious minority. Most people were not Latter-day Saints, so that was an interesting dynamic. I grew up with a lot of Catholics and Protestants, evangelicals, and so I grew up in an environment where my faith was being challenged pretty frequently. Maybe not directly. Sometimes it was directly, but sometimes it was just, naturally differences would arise, and you'd have to kind of think about what you believe and why you believe it, and decide if that is what you're going to believe throughout the rest of your life. So I grew up in the church. I would say that my conversion, so to speak, because even if you grow up in the church, you still have to go through a conversion process. And I think that that was something that took time. That was just kind of a more of a sunrise than a light switch. You know what I mean? Elder Bednar talks about revelation and how sometimes it's quick and clear and you go from darkness to bright, and sometimes it's very slow and gradual and like a sunrise, and before you know it, then you can see everything around you. And I think that for me, it was a slow process, slow and steady. And on my mission was a fantastic help for my testimony. I went into my mission with a testimony, but it only grew while I was on my mission. I served in Mexico, so entonces hablo español un poco, pero es más fácil expresarme en inglés. Hay que perdonarme, lo siento mucho. But I served in Chihuahua, Mexico. I forgot for a second there. Chihuahua, Mexico. It is a real place. I did not know it was a real place when I got my mission call. But I loved my mission. It was extremely difficult. But that's part of why I loved it so much, is I came out of my mission a completely different person than I went into my mission. And it was on my mission when really for the first time, you know, somebody looked me in the eye and said, Joseph Smith was a liar. Joseph Smith was a fraud. And you're not in the right church. You don't believe the right things. This is all a lie. And that was impactful to me, because when that happens, you have to decide, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to let it get to you? Are you going to believe them? Are you going to come to your own conclusions? Are you going to research things out? So that's kind of a core memory for me, kind of a milestone in my conversion journey, my faith journey, is, you know, suddenly I was being strongly challenged, and I had to decide what I was going to believe. And then I got home from my mission, and it wasn't until I started being more involved with Saints Unscripted that this world of faith journeys really opened up to me. Because growing up in the church, you know, you go to primary, you go to young men's and young women's, and you don't hear. The thing is that church is not meant to be where you learn you know, the ins and outs of church history. That's where you learn about the gospel of Jesus Christ, where you learn about faith in Jesus Christ, repentance, baptism, etc. You're not going there to learn about the Mountain Meadows Massacre or race and the priesthood, like these very technical issues that people are concerned about, and understandably so. But when I started getting more involved with Saints Unscripted, this world opened up to me where people have all these questions and concerns. And I was like, it was a little overwhelming at first, because I was like, what do I do with all this? And that's a kind of another milestone in my faith journey, is kind of being opened up to that world of controversy and faith struggles, and trying to figure out what to do with that. And maybe I'll just leave it at that, because I figure we'll probably talk more about that further on in the interview. But overall, my faith through looking at these challenging topics, it has been challenged, but I think it has been refined into something better than it was before. It's kind of like that refinement process that we talk about in the scriptures, where or we just it's a common metaphor in Sunday school, right? Like you put the metal in the furnace and it burns it, and it's painful sometimes, but then the dross rises to the top of the pile, and you can sweep it off, and you're left with something that's a little cleaner, a little more refined, a little more valuable. And I feel like that's what happened. That is what has happened with my faith, is that it's been scorched and burned, but through that process I've been able to, with God's help of course, turn it into something that has become very precious and more valuable to me than it has ever been in the past.
Yeah, you know, something that I think that's very interesting about your story is that uh, you pretty much had a, you know, quote unquote, a normal LDS childhood. And I think that sometimes we are very used to nowadays to hear that people learn about criticisms online and had a faith crisis, and maybe some even left church for a while, or others considered leaving the church. But I think that your case, it's interesting that never technically happened to you, and your research pretty much mainly started on the channel. And I think that it's a fresh perspective because as we continue, I think maybe the process in which we do the research on those different scenarios are different. So I think that my faith and beliefs, as I mentioned, covers many things. So I think that I'll first start with the criticisms, and then we'll continue with the other topics you cover. So starting with the criticisms, I wanted to ask you, sometimes we have websites that they do different things. I've I've seen one in English that are just quotes, and they don't give you any context or anything. They don't even try to explain it, but it's just a quote. And when you read the quote, it's the most maybe terrible thing, right? And that's it. The website just full of the quotes, and that's it. And sometimes the people running the website said that that's just history speaking for itself, right? That they're not doing anything. They're just exposing the facts. And if that's bad, that's their fault and not the website owners. And for example, we also have websites that explain the criticisms, and they explain how the only logical and even ethnic ethically or morally, that's the only good conclusion, to say that it's a fraud. So there are some topics that maybe don't have a lot of faithful answers. So sometimes it's hard to know what to think of those topics. So I wanted to ask you, when you research criticisms, what's your process and how do you know where to start?
Good question. So I think that it's really important when you get into these topics to go in with the right paradigm. If you go in with unrealistic expectations of what to find, then you're going to be disappointed a lot of the time because those expectations might get blown out of the water. So it's really important to understand, and this is something that we hit on a lot, at least in English these days, is that church members, church leaders, they have been and are all human, right? They all make mistakes. And we need to accept that. Like, I think sometimes conceptually we understand it, but then when we actually see mistakes that have been made, we're like, we panic, right? But we need to understand that, yeah, there have been mistakes that have been made. President Uchtdorf, now Elder Uchtdorf, but when he was in the first presidency, he said that in a general conference. He said mistakes have been made. I'm paraphrasing, but you can quote me. You can find the quote if you want, because it's very popular. So I think we need to understand that we're going to find things that are upsetting, and I don't think that everything needs to be defended. You know, if Joseph Smith punched a guy in the face, I'm just making that up, but if we find out that Joseph Smith punched a guy in the face, we don't need to twist and bend that into something, you know, amazing and glorious and miraculous. Like, sometimes they make mistakes, and you know, they're going to have to answer for them, just like all of us are going to have to answer for them. So the other thing to understand is that when you're studying history, and I will say that I'm not a historian. I'm an amateur historian. I'm not I'm not professionally trained in this stuff, which I think is an advantage because most people watching this aren't going to be professionally trained as historians. So I hopefully stand as a testament to the fact that you can do it. Like everybody at home, you can study this stuff and come to your own conclusions about it if you know where to go to find the information. But when it comes to studying history, two different people can look at the same evidence and come to wildly different conclusions about that evidence, or they can interpret the history differently. And that's okay, because I think that faith is always going to be a requirement in our mortal journey, right? Like if there was no need for faith, then we would have knowledge, but obviously God wants us to have faith. So having faith implies that there are going to be unanswered questions, or there's going to be ambiguity. Sometimes the answer won't be as clear cut as maybe we want it to be. And we need to understand that that's okay sometimes. Sometimes there are great answers. Sometimes there are perfectly good answers to our questions. Sometimes there aren't. So for example, the golden plates. Did Joseph actually have golden plates? I think there's a very good case that he did. He said that he did. There are a dozen or so witnesses saying, 11 official witnesses saying that he did, plus a bunch of unofficial witnesses that also said they saw them. I think that historically you can make a good argument that he had something, and I think he had plates. But at the same time, I can't prove that he did. I can't show you a picture of them and say, look, here they are. So two people can look at that history and say, and come to different conclusions. Somebody can say, you know what, I see these witnesses, but I think they lied or they were hypnotized. That's one of the theories out there, which I think is kind of laughable. But you're not forced to believe something that you don't want to believe a lot of the time. So I think that when it comes to these topics, one thing is that you want to look for firsthand accounts. Sometimes, like I remembered you were talking about these websites that just have a list of quotes, right? And they say, look, here's the raw information, here's the raw history, and it speaks for itself. Well, no, it doesn't, because we're getting it through your lens. Even if it is a direct quote, you're picking and choosing which quotes you're letting me see. So one of the keys here is to be very patient and not panic. Don't immediately, because that's one of the things that I think antagonists sometimes want you to do. They'll just give you a long list of so-called problems, and they're banking on you not doing your own research. They're banking on you just looking at what they're presenting you and taking it at face value and causing you to panic and your faith to spiral. Don't do that. Be patient and do your research. Now, that is going to be a lot harder to do in Spanish, because obviously a lot of documents from the restoration of the church are going to be in English. So if you have some skills in English, that's great. If you know somebody who knows English, maybe find some documents for them to translate for you. Ask for help. That's a ask for help from people who have skills, or who maybe have gone through these same faith challenges that you're going through right now and have come out all the better for it. But when it comes to a list of quotes, so for example, this is why you need to be careful. I was on social media several months ago, and I came across a post that was very similar to what you're talking about. It was just quotes. And one of these quotes was from a letter supposedly written by Emma Smith. And in the letter, she says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, she says, I never believed any of Joseph's revelations. I thought it was all the product of a frenzied mind. Or in other words, I didn't believe anything he said. He was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, which is an expression in English that I hope translates to Spanish well. So the idea is that you see that quote and you panic and you're like, oh my gosh, Emma Smith, the prophet's wife, didn't believe in his revelations. How can that be? Why haven't I been taught this at church? Has the church been hiding this? Have I been lied to? Slow down, be patient, don't panic. And so I had never seen that quote before. And this was last year, I think. And so there were some red flags that immediately went up, because if this quote had been authentic, I would be seeing it everywhere, especially from critics. So that's when you need to do your digging, do some homework. And what I found was this was supposedly a letter written by Emma Smith, but it wasn't actually written by Emma Smith. And in fact, almost immediately after this letter was published in a newspaper, Emma Smith saw it, and she totally rejected it. She said, "This is a forgery. This is not true. I don't know where this is coming from, but this is not what I said. This is a misrepresentation of what I believe." And so if you're just presented with the initial quote, you're not getting a lot of this context, and you can be thrown into a panic without realizing that Emma Smith herself denied it, you know? So when you come across these quotes, you need to understand that there's more to the story. There's probably more to the story than what you're seeing on the screen. And you need to be very careful about taking isolated quotes at face value.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And now that you mentioned this, I think, and I've said this before, but I think that since the pandemic, I mean, I think that in the 21st century, but since the pandemic, there's been a rise in interest about crime and cults and things like that. And I think that, there was murder among the Mormons, or keep, love, sweet, wealthy Warren Jeffs
Yeah,
uh,
I know the one you're talking about.
documentaries.
Keep sweet, pray and obey, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, something
Yeah.
like that. And yeah, stories about people who were crazy and they thought they were doing the right thing. In most cases, they were religious, right? So I think that now that we look at church history, people usually see those characteristics in Joseph or Brigham or things like that. And, for example, when would you watch those documentaries, there are people whom maybe, I don't know if the word tough is the right word, but they challenge the authorities, and they're like, wait, I heard Warren say this, or I heard uh, this other person say that, and things like that. And they come out as the hero because they push back, and eventually they save people from danger or harm or things like that. And I see that now when we look back at people who were pushing back against Joseph, for example, I see that the narrative is now that those were the brave people in the 19th century. They were the ones who were trying to rescue people from Joseph's harm. It's an example, right? I think that William Law, for example, I think in the Novel Expositor, he was basically accusing Joseph of doing human trafficking,
Mm.
right? And so I think that when people look back at history, they they match the modern day examples to the history. And when you do that, William Law is a hero, for example, in this case, and Joseph, he's a crazy guy who's just trying to find power, you know. And I think that that's, in my case, with the people that I've known, that's the main reason they no longer believe, and they they see things in a purely naturalistic way. So in that case, my question would be, when we look at history, it can be very hard to know the motives. But on your research, how can you tell apart, or what makes the restoration history different that than these modern day examples?
That's a good question. And I think it's really easy to sometimes zoom out and draw parallels and say, oh, look at how similar they are. They both did all these things. But when you zoom back in, we're actually talking about very different scenarios in different time periods involving different people and ultimately different practices. So we actually did, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because we actually did a whole episode on Saints Unscripted with Brian Hales. So Brian Hales, he wrote these books. These are it's a series called Joseph Smith's Polygamy. It's massive, okay? This is actually the series, and it was so big and massive that they actually wrote a smaller book that kind of summarizes what you're going to find in the bigger books. But we did a whole episode with him about this trend that you're seeing, specifically with Warren Jeffs, who is part of a breakoff sect of the church. He's not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's in a polygamous split-off group, and he's in jail right now for good reason. But we did a whole episode comparing Warren Jeffs and Joseph Smith, and they're just very different scenarios. And it goes back, I think, to when we're talking about motives, it goes back again to how you're interpreting the evidence. If you don't believe Joseph was a prophet, then God never commanded him to practice polygamy. And well, then why else would he be doing it? Well, probably to satisfy his own natural desires, right? But if you do believe he was a prophet, then that motive isn't as glaring as it is for other people. And it's actually been really interesting because, again, this comes back to doing your research. There's some really good research from Don Bradley coming out right now that sheds more light on the motives of Joseph, specifically as far as polygamy goes. And he makes the case, this is in a nutshell, but in Nauvoo, that many of his earliest plural wives were pregnant at the time, which if you were living back in the 1800s at that time, it was discouraged to be intimate, to be sexually intimate with women who were pregnant. It was just culturally, you didn't do that. And so it's interesting that Joseph is purposefully selecting wives that are pregnant because it's suggesting that he wasn't just trying to sleep around with them, that there was something else going on there. And it's really fascinating when you get into these details, because what you would expect to find from a sexual predator is not what the history is showing as far as motivations go. Now, there are some people who are going to disagree with me on that. And it goes back to, again, people looking at the same evidence and coming to different conclusions about it. But that's when I think it's important for people that are listening to make the decision to take your own testimony by the horns, to take control of your own conversion process, and understand that there are a lot of voices out there that want to pull you in all sorts of different directions and that are passionate about pulling you in all sorts of different directions. And you can't please everyone. If you decide to leave the church, people probably going to be upset or hurt by that, probably family members. If you choose to stay in the church, there might be friends or others who have left the church that are going to be upset with you for being a member of the church. So you can't please everyone. You need to go with your gut, what you feel is right. And I would encourage people to involve God in that process. History and research is great, and it's very helpful. But God is the source of all truth, right? So I think that if you're a believer, and even if you're not a believer, if you're willing to try to involve God in this process of discovery, I think it can be really helpful. But I also want to mention, because we've been talking about kind of this conversion process, this faith journey process. There's a really good, actually, there's another really good book I'll reference. This one, it's called Faith is Not Blind by Bruce and Marie Hafen. Bruce Hafen used to be a member of the Quorum of the 70. But in that book, they outline a really important process of spiritual maturity. And it's 3 stages long. The first stage is simplicity. Maybe you're familiar with this. And this is the stage where everything is hunky-dory. It's like if I were to compare it to marriage, it's like the dating portion before you get married, right? Like you're all putting on your best face. You're madly in love with each other. Everything is butterflies and rainbows. There's nothing wrong going on. Like the person that you've chosen is perfect. Same thing happens with us in the church. You know, you grow up in primary, you learn about Joseph Smith and these miraculous golden plates, and everything's perfect and clear cut. And I will also point out that this happens in a lot of different things in life. Math, even. You start out with simplicity. 1 + 1, 2. Great. Got it. Easy. But then stage 2 comes around, and stage 2 is complexity. This is when, you know, you get married and you realize that you disagree on how finances should be handled or on how to raise kids. And you start to argue, and you realize that, you know, you're not perfect, they're not perfect, and that to build a strong marriage, it's going to be work, right? Or in math, you go from 2 + 2 to algebra, to calculus, you know, to geometry. Math gets more complicated, and it's not as easy and clear cut as you initially thought it was. The same thing happens in the church. Maybe you dive deeper into history, because we've got 200 years worth of history in the modern church, in the modern restored church, and it's rich, and there's a lot going on, and we've got a lot of resources, a lot of documents that are teaching us about this history. And so maybe the deeper that you get into that, the more stuff you find that maybe you don't agree with, or that surprised you, or that shocks you. And at stage 2, at complexity, you have to make a choice. When you hit complexity, you can choose to leave. You can throw up your hands and say, this is too much. I can't handle this. This is too different from what I expected to find. Or you can try to push forward to stage 3 in this spiritual maturity process. And stage 3 is simplicity beyond complexity. So in stage 3 is a beautiful place to be. For example, back to our marriage example. You've hit the complexity, you know that neither of you is perfect and that you disagree on some things, but you push forward anyway, and you work through those things, and you have difficult conversations, and you make mistakes, and you fix those mistakes together, and you compromise, and you come to conclusions together. And maybe what your marriage looks like after complexity is not the same as what it looked like in the simplicity stage. I think that's probably true for every lasting marriage. It looks different at the end than it did at the beginning. Like that's part of the natural process as people grow and change and learn more about each other. So that's expected. And in the church, you can get to a place where you're informed about difficult issues, but you also understand why people stay anyway. And they understand why some of these issues don't bother faithful Latter-day Saints anymore, like maybe they used to at stage 2 in complexity. And I feel like that's kind of where I've arrived at in my faith journey, is a place where I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here, but as you mentioned, I've done videos about almost all of the main criticisms against the church. There's always more you can learn, and I'm sure I can learn more about each of these topics than I already do, but I'm familiar enough with the main criticisms that I don't expect any curveballs to be coming at me per se, as far as controversial information goes. And I'm still here because I've looked at these issues and I understand the critical perspective, and I'm going to respect the people that want to go that route. But there's also a faithful perspective and a way to navigate these things where you come out with your faith intact. Maybe it looks different than it did before, but there are primary questions and there are secondary questions. Primary questions are, is the Book of Mormon what it claims to be? If the answer to that is yes, if you feel confident in that, then a lot of the other questions might be interesting, but they don't matter as much. Is Cain Bigfoot? That question really doesn't matter if the Book of Mormon is true, and so when you hit the complexity and push forward to simplicity beyond complexity, you recognize that there are all sorts of tough questions and challenging information, but you've come to terms with that and you've kind of found your peace with that. I think that a lot of members of the church, once they're introduced to complexity, one of the fears is that, what else do I not know? Like, is there some testimony shattering bit of information that I'm not aware of yet that's just going to crush me? And I think that the more we study, the more we learn, the more confident we can be in our testimonies, and the less defensive I think we'll be. Because at least in my experience, when I was in high school, for example, when people came to me with tough questions about the church, sometimes I would react defensively because I wasn't informed about those things. But when you're informed, you can have a conversation and you can say, hey, I understand where you're coming from. This is what I think about this, and you can come to your own conclusions. And it's also important to be able to say, you know what, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Let me go study it out and get back to you. And that's kind of a show of your patience. Like, again, you need to be patient. Don't panic. Don't get defensive. Go research it and then come back and research it from if you're looking to be faithful, research it from faithful perspectives. Everyone is biased. The faithful side is biased. The non-faithful side is biased. You can research whatever you want and come to your own conclusions. In my opinion, I tend to trust the faithful scholarship more so than the less faithful scholarship. And I say that because I think that the faithful scholarship is under a microscope more so than the less faithful scholarship. For example, like you've mentioned, like websites that just list a bunch of quotes, they can get away with twisting a lot of information. And of course that happens on the faithful side as well. Like nobody's everybody's biased, and depending on the source that you're looking at, there's a spectrum of reliability. But when it comes to faithful Latter-day Saints scholarship, I tend to trust it more because if they were lying or purposefully twisting things, I think that they're going to get reamed by people online. There's going to be a lot more backlash against them than there would be for maybe an antagonist that's just throwing up controversial quotes on a website. So again, but be wary of every source you go to. Like, you need to be cognizant of biases and look at the research they're doing. Follow the footnotes, go to the primary sources, and see if how they're interpreting it lines up with what it looks like to you. And as I have done that, I have found plenty of room to move on to stage 3 of that spiritual growth process, simplicity beyond complexity. And it's a beautiful place to be. and I've been talking for way too long now, so I will turn the time back over to you.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing that, David. And now that you talk about the simplicity, complexity, and simplicity stages of faith, and you use the examples of math and marriage, I think that, and this is my last question regarding criticisms, but something that usually happens when people learn about criticisms is that they don't learn about them from church leaders or church material. It usually comes from other sources. And the sometimes the main question they have, or the main thing that bothers them, is that if they didn't ask, or if they didn't do research, probably they would have never found out about it. And sometimes they say that they have the right to know about it. And in this past few years, uh, we've been more open when it comes to history and things like that. We have the Saints volumes come out, and there are just so much research that's just being published. But maybe last decade, or a few years ago, uh, these documents and the information was not as available as it now is. And I've heard that people felt, I don't know, cheated in a way.
Mhm.
And for example, I saw your video on the seer stones, and if
Mhm.
that was covered up, and I see that you shared quotes that it was mentioned even in the 90s and years prior. And sometimes people uh, can feel, you know, bothered by the fact that the information is technically there, but you need to dig deep in order to find it. It's not as available, and sometimes people take that as the church trying to hide it and trying to make sure you don't find it. And for example, the 1832 account, I made a video about that, and I I got a comment because there were some things I was planning to say, but I forgot as I was recording, so I just didn't mention them. But I did talk about that, and someone said, well, it's obvious that, I think it was Joseph Fielding Smith. Uh, it's obvious that he thought that it was contradicting, so he was trying to whitewash history. So, as you've done research, how do you feel about that claim that the church has been trying to whitewash history, and they only come clean once there's just a bunch of backlash? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that this is a really good question, by the way. I think that we need to remember that the church, the leaders, the church history department is composed of people that don't know everything. And I think that right now we're living in kind of a golden age of research about Latter-day Saint history. And there's a lot of stuff coming forward, a lot of dots that are being connected that weren't necessarily connected before. For example, the seer stone thing, the discussion over whether Joseph used the Urim and Thummim or his personal seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon. And I think that church leaders just, there wasn't general agreement. There wasn't a unified conclusion about what the answer to that question was. And I think Joseph Fielding Smith didn't think that Joseph used a seer stone, so he didn't talk about it as much. I don't think that he was trying to hide it per se, because he knew that Joseph had a seer stone. He admits to that, but I think that he just interpreted the evidence differently than our historians are doing right now. So you can look at that and say, oh, he was whitewashing history, he was hiding things. I look at that and say, he just disagreed with what how we are interpreting the evidence today. So I don't think there was malicious intent there. But what I have been surprised by is how many resources there actually are about these difficult topics. The thing is that the church magazines, the Ensign, Sunday School, Elders Quorum, Relief Society, like the purpose of those organizations or publications is not to go over this stuff. Like, we're focusing on the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're focusing on faith and repentance and baptism and the gift of the Holy Ghost and enduring to the end. Like, we're not diving deep into history, not because we're trying to hide it, but because that's just not the purpose of what we do in church on Sunday. So if you grow up in the church and all you know about the church is what you hear at church, you're going to be getting you're looking at the church through a very small window. Now, everybody starts off that way. Again, this is the simplicity stage. Like, everybody starts off with simple, basic, foundational stuff, and then you can get into more complicated stuff later. But what I've found as I have gone into this world of complexity, this deeper world of history, is that there are faithful church members and church publications that are talking about a lot of these issues. We just don't know where to go to find that information. And it's not that the church is hiding it per se, it's because it's being published. Like, it's being published for public consumption in a lot of cases. It's just that we're not familiar with what those sources are. So, for instance, pardon me. For instance, BYU Studies is a publication through BYU, which is a church-sponsored organization that talks about a lot of difficult topics. The church gospel topics essays, those are more recent, as you mentioned, but those are there for public consumption. They're fantastic. They're challenging. They're going to challenge you a little bit, but those are there published by the church. You mentioned the Saints volumes. That's another recent source that we can look to. The Joseph Smith Papers Project has incredible documentation associated with it and commentary associated with it that they've been working on publishing for like the last, how long has it been? 15 years, many years now, including books. So, for example, like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, that is one of probably the first big controversial issues that Latter-day Saints might be introduced to. And there's not a ton of information about it. Like, that's not what we're talking about in Sunday school. And you can look at that and say, oh my gosh, the church is hiding this information. Or if you keep looking for other sources, like you might find a whole book published by, church historians about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. There's a ton of information that you can look at if you know where to find it. Another example, as we've already talked about, Joseph Smith's polygamy. There's a ton of information that's been published about it. You just have to know where to look for it. And again, this isn't like, if they were trying to hide this information, it wouldn't be published in, 3 huge volumes for public consumption. Now, these books aren't published by the church itself, unlike BYU Studies, which is a, church affiliated organization. But these are faithful church members that are grappling with these issues and showing kind of the faithful route that you can go through. And so I would encourage people that are encountering controversial information from antagonistic sources, I would encourage you to explore what the faithful sources are saying about it. In my experience, I don't think there's been a single controversial question that I have encountered that is new, that has not already been talked about by faithful Latter-day Saints. And that's something important for people to remember. If you find something controversial, please understand that it's very likely not anything new. It may be something that has, a lot of these criticisms that I deal with in videos have been around for almost 200 years now, and they just keep getting, reiterated, resurfacing over and over again. So be patient. Again, look for what faithful sources are saying. And if you need help with that, ask people, ask your bishop, ask your leaders, ask your parents. You can message me on Facebook. I have a public Facebook page, message me and ask me, hey, I ran into this information. What faithful sources can you give me that address it, that help contextualize it, that help maybe explain it? And I'd be happy to provide you with resources. And in each of my videos, in the YouTube description, I leave a bunch of resources usually that you can turn to for more information if you want to dive deep into these topics. I will say this about the claim that the church hides stuff. There have been some things that I've seen. So I'll give you an example, because I'm not going to say categorically, no, the humans that are involved in church leadership have never, downplayed anything, right? Like, I don't think that's true. I think things have been downplayed. For example, the word of wisdom, the way we interpret the word of wisdom today, prohibits us from drinking alcohol, tea, and coffee, right? I was looking at an article on the church's website that was a transcript of packing supplies for the pioneers before they came west. And I was looking at the article transcription next to the original newspaper listing from 1846 that had the packing list. And I noticed that in the transcription, a couple of things had been left off. So in the original packing list, it listed, I believe, if I'm recalling correctly, alcohol, tea, and coffee. And then in the transcript of that list, alcohol, tea, and coffee had been removed. So that's an instance where I'm like, you didn't have to do that. I understand why they did, because, we have our interpretation today, and they probably didn't want to sidetrack people and get into a whole, open up a can of worms about the interpretation of the word of wisdom. Like, I get that. I don't necessarily think that they were like behind the scenes, we're gonna whitewash history here. But I think that incidentally, some things are downplayed that don't necessarily need to be. But when it comes to the seer stone issue, I think that was largely just a disagreement about how they interpreted the history. Yeah, if you had any other specific examples, we could explore them. But yeah, that's kind of my opinion on that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, David. And the world of criticisms against the church is a big world, especially online. And something that I think it's also very important to take into account, and I think that you do that very well, is the fact that the church history and all of that is not just criticisms that need to be addressed. If it was just that, then it would be very depressing to be a member of the church. But there are many things that are faith promoting. So I wanted to ask you about that. How has your research, what have you encountered that has been faith promoting to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you bring up a really good point. Like, when you have tunnel vision and you only focus on the criticisms, that can be hard. That can be really challenging, because and I think sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. I don't know if that's going to translate into Spanish, but what it means is essentially we get so hung up on specific issues that we miss the beauty of the bigger picture, right? And in the church, the bigger picture is gorgeous in the way I see it. The doctrines we believe in are absolutely marvelous. They highlight the justice and the mercy of God so well. So, for instance, with the witnesses of the golden plates, the more so a lot of people will bring up very specific critical arguments against the witnesses of the golden plates. They'll say, oh, they never actually saw the plates, they only saw them with their spiritual eyes, or things like that. The more I have studied about the witnesses of the golden plates, the stronger my testimony has become of the Book of Mormon. And the more I've learned about the lives of Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery, the more I trust what they had to say about it. Like, these aren't con men. These are sincere people who were absolutely convinced that an angel of God had shown them golden plates, and they had no doubt about it. And you can get into second and third hand sources saying, oh no, he only saw the plates like seeing what some through a mountain pass or something like that Martin Harris supposedly said. But if you look at the big picture of what they're saying, I think that they make a very strong argument for the reality of the Book of Mormon plates, and not just the 3 witnesses, the 8 witnesses as well. And there are also unofficial witnesses that also have these really tangible experiences with the golden plates. And I am absolutely convinced that Joseph had something. He had plates. And people say, well, maybe he forged them, maybe he just made them up. But the 3 witnesses say that an angel showed them the plates. It's really difficult to fake an angelic experience, I would imagine. And that's one where some people just go off the rails, in my opinion, and say, oh no, they were on hallucinogenic drugs, or they were unconsciously hypnotized by Joseph Smith. And it's just like it's easier for me to believe that it was just an angel of God that showed them these things than it is for me to kind of contrive this theory where Joseph is drugging them or somehow hypnotizing them before that kind of hypnosis even really was popularized. But to answer your question, with just one example, studying history does not always lead to, making it harder to believe something. A lot of the time, studying the history strengthens what you believe in or what you already believed in, and it gives you more reasons to believe in it. It gives you more tools to work with as you navigate these issues. And I keep referencing books, but if anybody is wanting to learn more about the witnesses of the golden plates, this is a great place to start. This is Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses by Richard Lloyd Anderson. And he just goes over their lives. And this is one of those books that's been around since 1981, published by Deseret Book, the church's publishing company. And that's not to say that the church endorses everything published by Deseret Book, but it's Richard Lloyd Anderson was a faithful researcher, faithful scholar, and the witnesses are targeted very often because it's kind of a hinge point on whether or not the golden plates existed. You have to do something with the witnesses. Either they were co-conspirators, they were lying, or they were duped, or they were sincere. You have to decide what they were. And this is one of those books that's been around for a really long time that helps you to do that. That helps you to navigate it and learn more about the witnesses. And that was, in my faith journey, that was a really inspiring thing, to learn more about these men and women and what they had to say, what they experienced, and how they testified of it throughout their lives and even on their deathbeds. That's been really inspiring to me.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And I think that both things are part of history and part of research. We'll find things that aren't, things we expected. At the same time, we'll find things that will strengthen our faith. And I think that's just part of it. There will be things we'll be able to explain, things we won't. But we'll find both. So thank you for sharing that. And my very last question would be regarding, sharing the gospel in this day and age. I was on a mission when the Saints Unscripted missionary group started. And I remember that, everyone loved you. And they were just like, wow, David, he's the GOAT. And they were very fascinated by the videos, and they were saying that, oh, my investigator just had a question about this, and oh, now I know what to answer, and things like that. So I think that, well, in my case, I was terrified that I would find someone who would have those kinds of questions, because even though I had the answer, even though I knew what he was talking about, I didn't know how to connect that with the gospel. I didn't know how to eventually link that to the spiritual confirmation or the Book of Mormon or Jesus Christ. And I think that now, when we share the gospel, it can be a little different than it was before. And sometimes people can talk about the issues or the criticisms head on. Maybe a missionary can teach a lesson, and by the time they have the second lesson, oh well, I found this information online about this and this and this and this. And at first, or a few years ago, it was common to say, "Oh, that's anti-Mormon propaganda," and that's that, right? And but now we know that some of the things that are found online are factually true, or they reference true events. And sometimes if I think about sharing the gospel with my neighbor, and I talk about the gospel, they might ask, "Oh, you are the religion that uh, taught that black men were cursed," and you're like, and then you want to share the gospel, and at the same time you want to address those issues, and you want to be fair without being dishonest. So I think my last question is, how can we share the gospel in this new reality?
I think that, going back to my kind of the idiom of focusing on the forest instead of just the trees, I think that the overarching message is the most important message when it comes to the gospel. And that is that Jesus Christ is the savior of the world, and that he can save us from our sins, and that we can be redeemed, that we can repent, and we can be cleansed of sin. Like, that is the meat, the core of our message. And that's the reason we focus on it at church and in Sunday school and in elders quorum and Relief Society. And that's why our missionaries focus on, that message. I guess that's one of the messages they focus on. There's more there, but I would be straight with people, and I would just emphasize to them, look, we have primary questions and we have secondary questions. Here are the primary questions. Here are the primary things that we want you to know. Here's the meat of what we're trying to teach you. Or here's the meat of what I believe and why I believe it. There are also these other things. As you learn more about the church, you're probably going to find controversial information. And I'm happy to chat with you about those things. I wouldn't necessarily dodge those questions, because you do want to be open and transparent with people. And I think that it's a good thing to talk about them, because then when they, if they end up being baptized, they're going into it with a proper understanding of what to expect, and that means expecting sometimes ambiguity in history, or messiness in history, or wonderful things in history. So I think that's a good perspective to go in with. And I love when people join the church and they say, hey, I love Saints Unscripted. I've seen lots of your videos. And that's not just, again, to pat myself on the back, but I'm glad that by watching our videos, they have an awareness of these difficult issues, and they're not going to take them by surprise later on down the road. So when it comes to teaching the gospel today, I would suggest meeting people where they're at. If they have questions, go ahead and answer them. Maybe don't make them the primary focus of everything you're talking about. Maybe share with them kind of your perspective on it. And then you could even say, here's a video from Saints Unscripted that talks more about it. Maybe give it a watch, and when I come back, we can chat more, or something like that. I think that would be a good route. I don't know if missionaries per se can do that. I think a lot of them can, but for us normal members, I think that's a great thing to do. Sharing further resources is important because they're going to be looking up other resources anyways. And so it's important to give them resources that tackle these things from a faithful perspective as well. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Okay. I tend to ramble a little bit, don't I?
No, that's great. That's actually great, and I appreciate what you've shared and the work that you've been doing in Saints Unscripted. It's been really helpful, and in my case, I entered this world of complexity at just maybe a year or two before Faith and Belief started, and so it was fresh air. So I appreciate that. Thank you for what you've shared and the resources and books you've recommended. And before we end, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would just say that if people have questions, seek advice from people who have already had those questions. If you have questions that you're struggling with, hopefully they can talk to you, Brother Hernandez, or find me on Facebook, shoot me a message. I'd be happy to talk about these things. That's my favorite part about what I do, is just talking with people one-on-one about their questions. And so I'm happy to do that. We obviously aren't able to cover everything in this episode that people might find troubling or have questions about. So if you're in that process, there's no need to be ashamed of it. Having questions is a part of having faith, and I'd be more than happy to help you work through those things or give you resources so that you can work through them yourself.
Perfect. Thanks so much, David, and thank you for being on the channel. I truly appreciate it. And well, I'll say this last part in Spanish. Gracias a cada uno de ustedes por ver este episodio de Viajes de Fe. Y voy a dejar una liga a la playlist de los videos que ha hecho David. Creo que tienen subtítulos automáticos, así que creo que pueden servir. También dejaré un link para su página de Facebook, en caso de que gusten contactarlo por algo. Y al final, recuerden que el propósito de todo esto es que el viaje de cada uno sea más informado.